What if, tomorrow morning, guilt simply vanished? No heaviness in your chest. No lingering thoughts saying, I shouldn't have done that. No emotional echo after a harmful decision. You would still remember what you did. You would still understand the consequences. But you would feel nothing. No regret. No inner discomfort. No need to justify yourself internally. What would happen to the human mind if one of its oldest emotions went silent? And more importantly, what would happen to society? Guilt is not a random feeling. It is a psychological response developed to maintain social cohesion. From early childhood, humans learn that certain actions lead to internal discomfort. This discomfort discourages repetition. It teaches responsibility without the need for constant external punishment. Guilt operates quietly. Most of the time, no one sees it, but it influences choices long before laws or consequences appear. Across cultures and centuries, guilt has served a similar function. It aligns individual behavior with group survival. It creates an internal cost for harmful actions. A cost paid emotionally, not legally. Without guilt, the brain loses this internal feedback loop. The mechanism that asks, what did this mean for others? Now imagine that mechanism no longer exists. Not reduced. Not weakened. Completely gone. At first, the individual experience might feel liberating. Decisions would become faster. There would be no mental replay of past actions. No obsessive review of mistakes. No emotional punishment after choosing poorly. Anxiety linked to moral failure would disappear. Shame would lose its grip. Self-forgiveness would be automatic. This could feel like psychological freedom. But something subtle would change. Without guilt, mistakes no longer create internal resistance. The mind records the outcome, but not the emotional cost. Hurting someone would still be understood cognitively, but not felt emotionally. Lying would become easier. Exploitation more efficient. Self-justification unnecessary. Over time, behavior would shift. Not because people become evil, but because nothing inside them discourages harm. Actions would be guided by desire, efficiency, and reward, not by reflection. The individual would function smoothly, but introspection would shrink. A mind without guilt may feel lighter, but it also becomes quieter in places where reflection once lived. Guilt plays a role in how people define themselves. It marks boundaries. It tells us who we are not willing to become. Without guilt, identity becomes more fluid, less anchored to moral consistency, more responsive to circumstance. A person might act kindly one moment and cruelly the next. Without internal contradiction, the self becomes adaptive, not principled. This does not create chaos immediately. It creates flexibility. But flexibility without internal limits changes how individuals relate to responsibility. Responsibility shifts from something felt to something merely calculated. Human relationships depend on repair, and repair depends on guilt. Apologies matter because they carry emotional weight. Forgiveness exists because regret feels real. In a world without guilt, apologies become procedural. Words without emotional backing. Conflicts would not escalate emotionally, but they would also rarely resolve. Trust would weaken, not because people expect betrayal, but because there is no internal assurance of restraint. Relationships would still form, but they would be more transactional. Empathy might still exist as perception, but without guilt, it does not produce accountability. Connection remains possible. Commitment becomes fragile. When internal regulation disappears, societies compensate externally. Rules multiply. Surveillance increases. Consequences become more immediate and visible. Without guilt, Society cannot rely on conscience. It must rely on enforcement. Ironically, this does not lead to freedom. It leads to control. A guilt-free population requires stricter systems. Because nothing inside the individual restrains harmful behavior. Institutions grow heavier. Social trust thins. What was once regulated emotionally is now regulated mechanically. A society without guilt does not collapse instantly. It becomes colder, more procedural, more dependent on force than understanding. Guilt is painful. It interrupts comfort. It forces reflection. But that pain is what slows us down. Without guilt, the mind suffers less. But the collective pays the price. Without guilt, individuals feel freer. But society becomes more rigid. Guilt looks like a flaw in human psychology. Yet it may be the invisible structure holding human cooperation together. So the question remains, what if guilt isn't a weakness of the human mind, but the quiet cost of living together? This was a social experiment by AC Society.